Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Megan Wynn, and I'm the Community Events Manager at the Peninsula Open Space Trust, and I'll be your host for tonight. You're watching Fungi Fundamentals Part 3, The Wood Wide Web, hosted by Post and featuring mushroom scientist Christian Schwarz. Some quick housekeeping. You don't need to have watched parts 1 or 2 to understand tonight's talk. And I know many of you asked about foraging, edible mushrooms, and identification in your submitted questions, but I'm sad to tell you we won't be covering those topics tonight. For those, you can check out parts 1 and 2 in the description links below. So what will we be covering? Tonight, we're going underground to explore how mushrooms and plants interact. Do trees really talk to each other? And how does this underground internet actually work? That's what we'll dive into tonight. Tonight's 90-minute presentation will be interactive, and we encourage your participation. To ask questions in the live chat, please log into YouTube, and we will address your questions at the end. For the best viewing experience, you can watch directly on YouTube or click the full screen button on the bottom right corner of the video player if you're watching on the Post website. The recording will also be available on YouTube right after the event. If you need captions tonight, click the link in the YouTube chat or description to open them in a separate window. If you're on the Post website, captions will appear below the video player. Note there might be a short delay. Thanks for your patience as we work to make our events more accessible. Please follow the community chat guidelines to create a positive and inclusive environment. That means to be kind, no harmful speech, foster constructive discussions, no spam or self-promo, and we reserve the rights to remove any comments. For those of you who are new to Post work, we are a nonprofit land trust, and our mission is to protect open spaces on the peninsula and South Bay for the benefit of all. We are creating a network of protected lands where people and nature connect and thrive. And since 1977, Post has protected over 93,000 acres of land. Here's a short 30-second video on what we do.
Since our founding in 1977, Post and our partners have preserved the peninsula and South Bay's sweeping landscapes.
These are the places we know and love.
Places that wildlife call home.
Places we rely on for food, fresh air, clean water, and our health.
We're just getting started. Post protects nature because nature sustains us. Nature connects us all.
You can learn more about Post on our website at openspacetrust.org. We host many free events every single month, as well as share free resources like our hiking guides, blogs, events, and more. Before we dive into the program, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement and invite you to share what native land you are currently residing on and tuning in from today. The land in Post working area includes the territories of the Ama Mutsun, Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamya Nation, as well as other Native organizations and individuals who are descended from the first people of this land. These lands have been home to many Native tribes since time immemorial, and whose people are still here with us today. I want to acknowledge the land itself, including the Santa Cruz and Diablo Mountains, the San Francisco Bay, and the Pacific Ocean, as well as the watersheds and ecosystems that make up this landscape we call our home. Let this moment serve as a reminder that as residents of these places, we have a responsibility to be caretakers of our shared home and neighbors, including wildlife. All right, folks, if you're new around here, I have a fun surprise interactive activity for us tonight. It's time to play the Fungi Fundamentals Trivia Game Show. All right, folks, this is how you're going to play. You're going to need your phone or open up a new tab, a window on your laptop, or play in the chat or out loud to your friends and family in your living room. You can interact however you want, but go to menti.com, use that code at the top of that screen here, or scan that QR code. You guys can join in at any time to play. It's more fun if you play interactively and you see how many answers you get right or what the other groups are thinking and play along together. And if you're watching the recording, you can play along too and skip ahead for the answers. All right. You can join at any time. For the sake of time, we're going to keep it going. Here we go. Okay. First question. Parasitic fungi are harmful to plant communities. True, false, or other? Go ahead and lock in those answers. I see many folks have responded. I'm going to see if I can wait a few more until those get there. Giving you guys, this is our first question. Going to give you guys some time to get logged in. Don't forget, you can also type in the chat if you don't want to log in with your phone. Okay, here we go. A few more seconds, and I'm going to show what you guys thought. A lot of you guys think it's false. Is it the right answer? We'll find out. Here we go. The correct answer is other. I know, sorry, folks, we tricked you on this one. While parasitic fungi, by definition, harm individual plants, they play important roles in maintaining the diversity and dynamic stability of ecosystems as a whole. So here we go. Question number 2. Let's see if you can get this one right. Some mushrooms can make their own food using the energy of sunlight. True, false, or other? Let's see what you guys think. Log in those answers. I'm seeing lots of comments in the chat. How do we answer in the chat? Someone asked. You just write the answer in the chat like you would normally. Okay, true, false, or other? All right, let's get a few more answers in, and then I'm going to show you what everybody said. Here we go. Ready? And okay, many of you guys, okay, it's split between true and false. All right, let's show you the right answer. The correct answer is false. No mushrooms are known to photosynthesize. So there you go. Question number 3. Some plants have given up the ability to make food using energy from sunlight. True, false, or other? Some plants have given up the ability to make food using energy from sunlight. True, false, or other? Let's see what you guys think in the chat. Go ahead and lock those answers in. Feel free to type in the comments. I'm seeing lots of trues. I'm seeing lots of folks. Okay, here we go. Can we get a few more responses in? I'm going to show the answers, what you guys said. Okay, majority of you guys say true. Is that the correct answer? You would be right. The answer is true. A number of orchids and blueberry family plants steal sugars from mushrooms and don't make any of their own. So they've given up the ability to photosynthesize so that they can steal sugars. That's pretty cool. Okay, next question. You guys are doing great. Let's keep it going. 2 more questions here. Trees cooperate by sharing resources in times of scarcity. True, false, or other? Once again, the question is, trees cooperate by sharing resources in times of scarcity. True, false, or other? Go ahead and lock in those answers either on the app or on the chat. I'm seeing a few more. Let's see if we can get a few more responses. Let's show everybody what you're thinking. Here we go. Most of you guys said true. Okay, if you said false or other, let's see what the answer is. Here we go. The answer is other. Oh no, we kind of tricked you on that one. Although some evidence suggests this, there is plenty of conflicting evidence to the contrary. The full story depends greatly on interpretation. We can definitely ask our mushroom expert, Christian Schwarz, for more background info on that one. And that might pop in later in the lecture. Okay, good job, everybody. Okay, last question. Here we go. All plants form mutualistic relationships with at least one fungus. True, false, or other? All plants form mutualistic relationships with at least one fungus. True, false, or other? I know some of you guys in the chat here are saying that's tricky. I know we can talk to our mushroom scientist, Christian, about that one later and share a little bit more about that. He's backstage listening to all of us talk right now, so he'll get to that later. Okay, last question. Let's make it count. Let's see what you guys think. True, false, or other? Let's see what most of you say. Most of you think it's false. Okay, let's review the last answer here. The answer is other. Once again, another other answer is probably false. So the ones that you guys said false, you're probably also correct. Although the large majority of plants on Earth form some kind of mutualistic relationship with fungi, there do appear to be some that shun fungal partners or completely, or which parasitize fungi themselves. Okay, another question we can probably get a follow-up with our mushroom expert, Christian, later on. Okay, everybody, thanks for playing. That's the end of the trivia game show. Good job. Clap to yourselves. Applause to you trying. And I hope you guys learned something new. Thumbs up in the chat if you guys enjoyed that. And let me get off the game show stage here and go back to our program. Okay, here we go. So I know tonight isn't about foraging, but I know many of you are still interested in the topic. And with almost 3,000 people registered for this event and hundreds of you watching live on YouTube right now, we need to share this important message. If all of us went off trail in search of mushrooms, it would be seriously damaging to our ecosystem. So there are two things I want you all to keep in mind and promise if you can do this for the environment. Number one, recreate responsibly. Foraging is prohibited in most local open spaces because it disrupts the ecosystem's balance. Always check the rules before taking anything from public lands, and remember that private lands require landowner permission. Plus, misidentifying mushrooms can seriously make you sick, and we see those headlines every year, this year being no exception. And number two, please stay on trail. Going off trail damages soils, harms native plants, spreads invasive species, and causes erosion. By following these simple rules, we can help protect these spaces for wildlife and future generations because conservation starts with each one of us. All right, with that being said, I've kept you all waiting long enough. Let me introduce our speaker tonight. Christian Schwarz is an educator and naturalist from California. He has co-authored 2 field guides called The Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast and Mushrooms of Cascadia. He is a research associate at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and the Ken Norris Center for Natural History at UC Santa Cruz, where he has taught undergraduate courses in mycology and community science. Let's bring in Christian to the stage. Hey, Christian.
Hi.
Welcome. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to be here again.
Thanks for joining us for the 3rd time. Before we dive into the content you'll be sharing with us in this presentation, the people want to know, what is your favorite mushroom and why?
My favorite mushroom is probably, at the moment, Leptonia carnea, and that is just one of the names that mushroom goes by. It's the name you'll find it under in our book, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and I like it because it reminds me of home. It's a mushroom that loves growing as redwoods, and that's where I lived for most of the past 20 years. And it's not super common. It's kind of a rare mushroom, so I look forward to seeing it every year, and I haven't seen it this year, so I'm still waiting to have my encounter with this beautiful blue iridescent mushroom that's got little yellow droplets all over it.
Well, that sounds amazing. I hope more rains will come so you can see more flourishing mushrooms. Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about what you'll talk about today? Maybe go over some of the quiz questions we just saw.
What I'm going to talk about today is what is going on beneath the level of the surface of the soil and how fungi and plants interact, but particularly with an eye towards what you may have heard in sort of public media, what you may have read about in news articles, and a little bit about primary research. So the stuff that I get in more academic settings and how these two things come into contact. If you were frustrated by the quiz questions, I have bad news for you. The whole theme of tonight is that the answer is usually other, and that much of what we know doesn't really fit into easy true and false categories about this sort of phenomenon of the Wood Wide Web. It is really complicated and hard to summarize in a neat story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am sure our audience is prepared to be mind blown by your expert science communication skills to digest these complex concepts. And we can't wait for it. So a reminder to our live audience, if you wanted to participate in the live chat and ask your questions, we're seeing them right now as we speak. We'll also bring up the questions later in the Q&A session. Okay. All right, Christian, let's get your slides up and take it away.
Okay. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm pretty excited about this. It's usually my most publicly attended event of the year. So big thanks to the Peninsula Open Space Trust for putting this on again and being open to running a somewhat unusual topic that's not so directly about mushrooms. It's more about ecology, the interaction of organisms. And it's also a lot about science communication as it happens in the civilization that we're now in the middle of, which is enabled by social media and the sort of drive towards narrative that causes, as well as sort of the structure of science and how what is found out in the academia setting flows outwards to the general public and becomes interpreted in different ways, both in fiction as well as in news headlines and even sort of word of mouth, and can, through a game of telephone, end up being a little different or substantially different from what was actually determined by the researchers themselves. So my talk tonight I have called The Wood Wide Web 30 Years Later. Many of you may have heard this term, the Wood Wide Web. It's sort of a cute little meme that has become very popular because it communicates pretty well the sort of core concept of what's going on in this phenomenon I'm going to be using as the center of my talk tonight. But before we get into that, I just want to give you some background for what I'm going to be talking about, starting with these sort of 4 chapters. So the first one is the background of the system itself, the phenomenon itself. And what I mean by this is the mycorrhizal relationship. We'll get into what that is in a second. If you've never heard that word, we'll say it a number of other times, and I encourage you to practice it at home, just saying it out loud to yourself. Then I'll talk about the research that has been done starting way back in the 1800s and up to the present day, that sort of gives us what we know in an academic sense, through the scientific methods of determining knowledge. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about narratives, where some of these messages have ended up in the public eye, both in movies and TV shows and books and news articles. And then I'm going to sort of leave you with what I think some of the takeaways are, where those two different areas, research and narratives, come into conflict. So those are the 4 chapters, so to speak, of this talk, and I'll just get right into the background. So for background, fungi are not plants. Most of you probably know this, especially if you've been to one of the 2 prior post events or any of my other webinars through Backcountry Press or one of my talks at some mushroom fair somewhere. But fungi are a totally different kingdom of life. They're not the same as plants. They're really importantly different. And one of the most important ways that they're different is that fungi don't make their own food. They are like us. They require some sort of external source of organic matter to fuel their growth and metabolism. Plants can do that magic trick. They photosynthesize. They have chlorophyll. They can turn sunlight and carbon dioxide and water and a few soil minerals into sugar, their own food. They make their own food from inorganic materials. So this difference between fungi and plants leads directly to the relationship that I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is a way of ecologically matching the strengths and weaknesses of these 2 groups of organisms, these 2 big kingdoms of life. So what are some of the fungi that do the mycorrhizal relationship that I'm going to be talking about? The first thing I want you to know is that it's not all mushrooms. In fact, not all fungi by any stretch of the imagination do this sort of ecological relationship. It's actually a very small subset of the overall kingdom of fungi that enter into the relationship that I'm going to be talking about tonight, the mycorrhizal relationship. And some of these mushrooms are very familiar to us, like the amanitas that you see on the screen in the upper left, the russulas, the boletes, the milk caps, the coral mushrooms, cortinarius mushrooms, chanterelle mushrooms, tooth mushrooms, truffles. These are some of the most well-known, well-loved, attractive, beautiful mushrooms of the forests of California. But many other mushrooms don't do this at all. So I want you to just keep in mind that when I talk about this, it is not something that every mushroom is doing. It's not anywhere close to a majority. It is just a particular subset of fungi that have innovated this relationship with trees, or as you'll see, not just trees. So I'm coming back to this term now to define it. The mycorrhizal relationship, it comes from these 2 roots that mean, no pun intended, these 2 word fragments, myco, which means fungus, and rhizo, which means root. And it literally means the relationship between a fungus and a root, but in a particular conformation that looks like what you see at the lower right here, which is when the mycelium, that underground branching network of fibers that radiates around the mushroom that we see above ground, wraps itself around the root hairs or root tips of a tree or a shrub and makes these sort of finger-like knobby branched projections, covers the root tips in a sort of a blanket or a sheath of fungal fibers. And what happens at this site, at this conjunction of fungus and root tip, is a symbiosis, a particular form of a symbiosis that we call a mutualism. So let's move on here. So what is the mutualism? What does it do for each partner? So when I say mutualism, what I mean is it's a form of symbiosis that is reciprocally beneficial for both partners. So both the tree or the shrub, the plant partner, and the fungal partner get something out of being in this relationship that benefits them, that increases their fitness, that enables them to grow bigger or faster or in more places than they would otherwise be able to. Symbiosis, just so you know, is a word that includes parasitism. So parasites are also symbiotic. They're just the other side of the spectrum, where one partner is harmed or does not benefit, is negatively affected, and the other partner is the only one that's getting a benefit from the relationship. So these are two ends of the spectrum: mutualism on one side, parasitism on the other side, but they're all forms of symbiosis. But I'm going to come back now to the mutualism, to the mycorrhizal relationship, and just tell you the basics, which is that the fungus, that branched network of fibers, the mycelium that's underground, has an enormous surface area and some interesting, powerful enzymes and the capacity to absorb a lot of water and a lot of nutrients and mobilize them in a way that plants can't do as efficiently. So what the fungus is able to do is to mobilize water and phosphorus and nitrogen and other sort of soil nutrients and resources and send them to the photosynthetic partner, so the tree or the shrub, and in exchange, the fungus receives sugar in the or sometimes also we just say carbon, but in the form of sugar, photosynthetic products, to fuel their own growth. So fungi are able to grow using this sugar. That's where they get their organic matter in this case. All the other fungi that you're familiar with that may be decomposers, they're just breaking down dead organic matter. They are taking the leaves or the wood or the twigs of a tree that has fallen or died, and they're digesting that dead organic matter to get building blocks of sugars. But that sugar has already been locked up in the form of leaves and twigs and wood, and it's not as efficient as going directly to the source of sort of getting the sugar in its pure form from the tree itself. So in some ways, you can think about the mycorrhizal relationship as a fungus trying to move closer to the sun, to get closer to that ultimate original source of energy that a photosynthetic partner uses to make sugar using its chlorophyll. Another important thing to keep in mind is that even within this limited subset of fungi that can do this relationship, not every one of them can partner with every plant. There is some amount of specificity going on here. Certain trees and certain mushrooms form relationships, and while some of them are very general, they have a wide range of flexibility that they can partner with many different shrubs or trees. There are some trees and some fungi that are one-to-one. They can only partner with a very small range of potential hosts or symbionts. And the particular form of this that I'm going to be talking about tonight is hundreds of millions of years old. Now, that sounds old, and it is, but it's not as old as the whole lineage of fungi themselves. So it actually took a while for this form of the relationship to evolve on the surface of land after fungi evolved from their algae ancestors. Okay, so with that background in mind, let's get a little deeper. I'm putting this timeline on the screen so that you can sort of get a sense that there has been a progression in our understanding of this relationship over time. And if you go all the way to the left of this timeline, you'll see that the first time that Kaminsky described this fungus-root relationship in 1881, that's actually not very long ago. That's a blink of an eye in the sort of broad scope of knowledge that we have about other kinds of living organisms and other kinds of, compared to physics or compared to math, we have not known about the existence or the function of the mycorrhizal relationship for very long at all. We're still in the first couple centuries of learning about this relationship. The first relationship that was described didn't actually make any claims about what was happening at this site or this juncture of root and fungus. Kaminsky just noticed that there was something happening, that fungi and roots were attaching to each other in a way that was not random and it was special. There was some sort of new structure being formed in some cases where some fungi were meeting some trees. A few years later, A.B. Frank actually applied the term mycorrhiza to describe these fungus roots. In 1960, a researcher named Bjorkman found that there's actually a transfer of sugar, or carbon is the abbreviation you'll see on the screen. That C means carbon, and it just means sugar, from a tree to a mycoheterotroph, which is a big word, but I'm actually going to show you some examples of what those mean. But those are plants that don't make their own sugar. They actually get them from somewhere else. So these are plants that have lost their photosynthetic capacity. And Bjorkman showed that fungi were involved in the relocation of sugar from a tree to these non-photosynthetic plants. And that was some of the earliest proof that we have, or evidence that we have, of these common mycorrhizal networks where two different plants are connected by a fungus. I'm going to skip over Jack Harley for the moment. We're going to talk about him later, sort of out of order towards the end of the talk. But in 1997, this is a really important date because Suzanne Simard, who's going to be sort of a recurring character in tonight's talk, published a paper in Science showing that there was a transfer of sugar, in this case abbreviated as carbon once again, between trees of different species. And this was a really big deal when it came out. And actually in the same issue of Nature where she published this research, a commentator, one of the editors, invented the term the Wood Wide Web. And that's where we get this WWW in this context. What that means is the Wood Wide Web. It was on this date, 1997, in Nature, that this term was coined. And it really took off after that. A lot of researchers became really fascinated by the idea that trees could exchange resources, even trees of different species, potentially through a fungal intermediary, a linkage. In 2008, Paul Stamets gave a TED Talk called 6 Ways That Fungi Can Save the World. And that actually had its own really large impact in creating an additional new wave of interest about how underground networks of mycelia were operating on the surface of the earth and how we might use them as ecologists or stewards of land conservationists. In 2019, in this period between 2008 and 2019, there was what I call the new wave of primary academic research, science, heavy-duty science, adding a lot of complexity to what we thought we were starting to understand about how fungi and trees interact and how plants communicate with one another or don't, using fungal intermediaries or via fungal intermediaries. In 2019, this big documentary style movie called Fantastic Fungi came out. Many of you have probably seen it. This is a Louis Schwartzberg film, and that caused another sort of second wave of interest and excitement about fungi and mycorrhizal networks and underground mycelia and their functioning on the surface of the planet. And a lot of people sort of really were turned on. Their awareness came to this world through Fantastic Fungi, through this documentary. A few years later, in 2021, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks was formed and became popularly visible. That's abbreviated here as SPUN. Suzanne Simard published a memoir called Finding the Mother Tree, which was extraordinarily popular. So popular, in fact, that it played a sort of a role in a popular TV series called Ted Lasso, which many of you have probably seen. And at this point, I would say that the concept of the Wood Wide Web kind of reached its crest of popularity. It's like most hot topic buzz in the public awareness. And just 2 years after that came Justine Karst's critique, one of the first parts of an academic backlash to this wave of enthusiasm and sort of potentially carried away feeling that had become widespread in the public consciousness. And that's where we are today, 3 years later. We're sort of in the midst now of a reckoning or sort of a grappling within the scientific community and within the public awareness about what we actually know, what we don't know about what the Wood Wide Web actually is and how it functions. So that's the timeline, and now I'm going to walk you through some of the research. Okay, so what are common mycorrhizal networks, CMNs? This is just another abbreviation that you will see in a lot of the academic literature instead of Wood Wide Web. Wood Wide Web is sort of the public-facing nickname for what we call in the academic literature common mycorrhizal networks. It's a slightly more precise term, but all it means is two or more individual plants connected by a single same fungus. There actually may be more than one fungus connecting two plants, but for our purposes, we're just going to focus on the one case where two different plants are connected by one individual fungus. And it's important to remember that these plants may be of the same species, they may be of the same age, they may be of different ages, they may be of different species, and all of these particular arrangements differ in important ways. So, like I said, this big word mycoheterotrophs really just means plants that get their nutrition by stealing sugar from a fungus. But in this case, the fungi that they steal from are themselves connected to another plant that is photosynthetic, that does make its own sugar using chlorophyll, usually a tree or a shrub. And as you can see from the pictures on the screen, these are orchids. These are members of the blueberry family that have lost their green pigments. They've lost their chlorophyll. And so what they have instead are these red or white colors. And they underground, their roots are in contact with the mycelium of a fungus that is getting sugar from a photosynthetic shrub or tree. And these plants, the mycoheterotrophs, are stealing their sugar from that fungus. And this is undisputed and well-known, well-established evidence showing that resources in the form of carbon, sugar, can move from one plant to another via a fungal conduit. So we know for sure that this is a pattern that does happen. We have strong evidence that no one is confused about to show that this can happen in principle and in practice. So how far does that principle extend is the question that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the talk. So just to give you a sense here, on the left, you have an orchid called Coralorhiza. You can find this all over the peninsula, San Francisco Bay Peninsula. At the bottom, there's a truffle fungus, and on the right, there's a ponderosa pine. And you can imagine that the truffle fungus and the ponderosa pine are in the mutualistic relationship that I described to you earlier as the mycorrhizal relationship. The fungus uses its mycelium, all those cobwebby fibers at the bottom of the screen, to send water and nutrients to the tree. And the tree sends sugar from its needles, down its twigs, down the trunk, into the roots, where the mycelium is wrapped around the root tips, and it's absorbing that sugar from that photosynthetic partner. But the coral root fungus on the left is also in touch with that mycelium at the same time, and it's sucking away some of those sugar resources that were originally generated by the pine tree, using the fungus almost like a straw. It's slurping away that sugar out of the tree's roots and into its own body to make its flowers and its seeds and its fruits. So you can envision this as sort of a three-way relationship where the fungus and the tree are in a mutually beneficial positive relationship. The fungus and the orchid are in a parasitism where the orchid parasitizes the fungus, and then indirectly, the orchid is also a weak parasite on the tree. Even though it's 1 degree removed, it's taking some of that tree's sugar and interfering with the health of its mutualistic symbiotic partner. So that's just how this relationship looks when visualized as a three-way sort of dynamic. So I want to talk about Suzanne Simard a little bit more now. So in 1997, she published some research showing that radioactively labeled carbon, carbon-13 and carbon-14, she could trace these isotopes of carbon between different species of trees, in this case, Douglas fir and birch in interior forest settings in Canada. It's worth noting, though, that the amounts of carbon that she was able to follow were relatively small. So the amount of sugar, or at least let's say carbon for now, because as we'll see later, it's not necessarily even true that just because you are able to follow a molecule of carbon from one tree to another, it's not necessarily true that it is moving in the form of sugar. It may move in other forms. And unfortunately, the technology of the time wasn't really able to precisely show what form it was moving in. So all we knew from this research is this very intriguing finding that it appeared that carbon was being moved from one tree to another of different species. And that was really fascinating for the time. Not many people expected that this potentially mutualistic relationship between two different species of trees could exist. It's also worth noting that the movement of sugar in these relationships followed what is called source-sink dynamics, where one tree is the source of the sugar and the other tree is the sink. So the ultimate sort of resting place for that sugar, assuming it's sugar, of course. In this case, that looks like trees that are in the sunlight are excellent sources of sugar because they have plenty of light to photosynthesize, and trees that are in the shade are potentially sinks, places, individuals that can't photosynthesize as much because they don't have as much sunlight, and so they potentially need some of that sugar to be translocated to them if this relationship works the way we think it does. But it's also possible that sugar is just moving down other gradients naturally without being sent on purpose or in any sort of adaptive way. And that is where sort of a lot of this complex research later comes in. Eventually, Suzanne Simard's research was summarized in this concept called the mother tree hypothesis, suggesting that one big mature tree that had a lot of healthy underground fungal partners could actually benefit its own seedlings that fall near it by plugging them into the same network that it's attached to. And so the mother tree is able to send some of her own resources, sugar or water or whatever, to its offspring via the same fungal conduit that both of them are connected to. This was extended potentially to that interspecies hypothesis as well, where trees of two different species might be connected to the same network, and you might see movement of resources around the forest via these fungal highways or the wood wide web of connectivity. So the idea here was that young saplings or young tree seedlings might have a real advantage if they were plugged into the same network as their mother tree. But this gets complicated really fast. And in fact, it's complicated even by research that came out long before the mother tree hypothesis was sort of popularized. And one of the most obvious ways that it can be complicated is by what's called negative density dependence. This sounds complicated, but it's actually a fairly straightforward idea, which is that beneficial fungi are not the only fungi that the mother tree hosts. There are also parasitic or damaging fungi that may come from a high density of related trees being in one place. And this is something that we know from human settings. If there's a bunch of people in one lecture hall and some of them are sick, it's much likelier that all of them are going to get sick than if there's just 3 or 4 widely scattered people in the same lecture hall, only one of whom is sick. So this was the whole story of COVID, social distancing. The opposite or the same thing is true for plants. And a lot of this research comes from tropical settings where trees are very densely packed together, but it has also been shown to have some evidence in temperate forests like we're used to in California, where the more trees of one species you get close together, the greater the prevalence of their parasitic fungi that particularly affect or infect that species. And you can actually get the opposite effect from what the mother tree hypothesis would suggest, which is that trees that are closely related to one another, that are densely packed together, actually die in higher proportions when they are close to a parent tree. And they actually survive better when they're some distance away, further away from that potential root zone. Some of this actually doesn't even need a fungal parasite to happen. Even just the shade of the mother tree can be hard for saplings to tolerate. So if there's a big pine tree that throws a lot of shade on the ground around it, and the seedlings of that pine tree germinate within that shaded canopy, they may die simply because they don't have enough light. So even just the physical structure of being near a mother tree produces patterns in pine trees, for example, where the seedlings survive better when they're further away from a mother tree, and they actually die when they're closer to it. So this acts as sort of like a counterbalancing bit of dynamic evidence to what the mother tree hypothesis might suggest. Now I want to talk about one of my favorite bits of research related to this concept, which came out in 2010 from Song et al., in which these researchers showed some really strong experimental evidence of the existence of the Wood Wide Web. And so what they did was that they took a donor plant. In this case, they used tomatoes, and that's the plant you see at the center of this little circular diagram, which I took from their paper. And they connected this donor plant to different treatments of surrounding plants that were connected in different ways. In one case, they weren't connected at all. They were isolated from one another. And that's used as a control to show that the other treatments actually were different. In another treatment, the connected plant was attached to the donor plant by both roots and by fungi, but then the connections were broken. So the connections were allowed to form and then they were broken. So this is sort of an additional layer of a control. In another treatment, the roots and the mycorrhizal fungus connecting the two partners were allowed to grow together. So both roots and fungi in contact. And then the last treatment, there was a barrier, a mesh barrier that allowed fungal connections between the plants to form, but not root connections. So this is intended to determine which of those two connections, either plant root connections or fungal connections between the roots, were more important for the next step I'm about to talk about, which is what happens when you expose that central donor plant to a stress. In this case, you expose that central donor plant to aphids, to a little herbivore, a little pest. Well, you see the donor plant do exactly what you would expect. It changes its hormone levels. It closes up its stomata to try and keep water in. It acts like it's stressed out, it's under attack, and it has some physiological responses that you can measure. And what the researchers found was that the disconnected plants that were, isolated in bell jars, so they had no aerial contact either, no exposure to aphids, they didn't do anything. They did not react as if they're exposed to aphids. But the other plants, the two at the bottom that had root contact and fungal contact, they did show upregulated stress responses as if they were being attacked by aphids, even though they were isolated by these bell jars. There was only connections to that donor plant that could explain this change in their physiology. And the idea here is that this is experimental evidence in a laboratory setting showing that information can move, some sort of signal, and I want you to remember that word because I'm going to complicate it a little bit in a few slides, some sort of signal moved from that donor plant that was exposed to stress to the connected plants that had a fungal contact with that donor plant. In 2012, a few years later, a couple researchers, Barto et al., did a sort of a summary of the potential routes along these fungal contacts that two plants might be exchanging or receiving what they call infochemicals. And really, these are just chemicals that exchange information whether or not it's intentional. And what they sort of tried to talk through is that not all of these chemical compounds, all of these molecules, are equally able to move in different paths through the fungal connection between the different plants. And they have this sort of cool diagram showing that you can think of the fungal cells as tubes, but those tubes can actually aggregate into rings of tubes or cords of tubes that have air in the middle or water in the middle. And they actually go to a great length to point out that the cell walls of these fungal tubes are not easy for molecules to get into or out of. And they actually suggest that it's perhaps unlikely that these kind of chemical molecules that act as signals are actually moving inside the tubes because they're too big and too complex to get across these rather waxy, impermeable walls. It would be hard for those molecules to move freely in and out of those fungal cells. So what the author suggests is that maybe these molecules are moving inside the bigger rings composed of many sets of tubes, or even on their outsides, because the authors point out that the cords themselves can act as little tunnels through the soil, which is, in this case, represented by these little pebbles at the lower right. These little granules are very hard for water to move through just by itself, passively. There's too many little gaps and crevices, and water moves very slowly through that kind of a structure of soil. And when a fungal tube pushes its way through these grains, it makes a kind of pre-excavated or pre-dug path for water to flow through. And so water may just be passively carrying these sort of information signal chemicals down the outside surfaces of the fungal cells without actually ever entering the fungal cells themselves. So this is a really interesting sort of very fine-grained, detailed view of how this might be happening. And it actually changes our interpretation of some of the results. A couple other interesting bits of research to sort of focus on is that if you take a single tree and you split its ball of roots into two, and you expose different parts of the root ball to different fungi, it's been found that trees can actually discriminate between their different fungal partners, and they actually have strong preferences for certain fungi and not for others. So just because a tree is connected to a fungus does not mean that it prefers to send its resources to that fungus. It may actually have a hierarchy in the sort of quality of the partner that it prefers to send its resources back to. And this adds a layer of complication to what we think might be happening at the forest scale when two different trees are connected by the same fungus. It may not be the case at all that that same fungus is equally receiving nutrients from both trees or resources from both trees in the form of sugar. Likewise, these researchers were able to find that if you split the root ball of a single tree and you connect it to the same fungus on both sides, but one of those fungi is given nutrients, nitrogen, to trade, and the other one is depleted from that nitrogen, the tree can, in some cases at least, detect the difference between different parts of its roots and send sugar to the part of its root ball that is connected to the high quality fungal partner that actually has nitrogen to trade for that sugar. So there's some very fine level bodily sensing, so to speak, of these plant partners. But it's not true that every plant does this. We only have a few examples where this has been tested in the lab and shown how fine the discrimination can be. It's also probably true that some plants are not good at doing this discrimination at all. In a couple of these papers that I have cited at the bottom of the image here, there are probably such a thing as low quality partners. Since not all plants have the same ability to discriminate between the fungi they're connected with, it's probably the case that some of these fungal partners are just hiding and sort of trying not to be noticed amongst a crowd, so to speak, of better mutualistic partners that are pulling more nutrients from the soil and exchanging them for sugar. And a few of these root tips are connected to fungal partners that maybe exchange a little bit of resources, but nowhere near as much as the other fungi connected to the same root system. So this is another added wrinkle of complication. This is where I'm going to get back to Jack Harley, who was a researcher from actually a lot of the 1900s, but especially the core of the 1900s. Right around 1975, he had some papers where he sort of theoretically talked through some ways of thinking about what the fungal sheath or covering around root tips actually does. And he brought up the point that it's not necessarily true that the fungal network extends the root system. It may actually, by covering the tips of the roots, act as a preventative sort of a block so that the root can't access the soil on its own terms, and that it has to trade with the fungal partner in order to get access to all of the resources that it would otherwise be touching directly by itself. And he noticed that some evidence that might suggest this model came in the form of the fact that fungi were shown to delay their exchange of phosphorus for sugar. So it wasn't just a constant back and forth flow of sugar and phosphorus. There was actually a constant flow of sugar towards the fungus and only occasional releases, delayed, of phosphorus from the soil back to the photosynthetic partner or the plant. And he also pointed out that sugar, if you're just tracking it as carbon atoms, doesn't necessarily always flow in the form of sugar. You may be thinking you're tracking sugar, but what you're actually tracking is carbon molecules or sugar molecules that have been turned into amino acids, which are the precursors of proteins. And it may actually require sugar expenditures, or sort of an expenditure of energy from the other plant partner to even absorb these amino acids. So it may be almost exactly the opposite of what you think you're seeing, which is rather than the movement of sugar, which is like food or energy, what you may be seeing is the movement of amino acids that actually require the expenditure of energy to even absorb them. That's still a really interesting dynamic, but it's definitely different from the model that Suzanne Simard's 1997 paper suggested to a lot of people. So we need to keep that in mind as a potential complication when we're thinking about how the Wood Wide Web actually works. this is a really sort of an odd image for a lot of you who are California mushroom hunters, because no one thinks of this as mushroom habitat. These are Joshua trees in the Mojave Desert. But a really cool paper came out just a few years ago from UC Santa Cruz, where I was a student, from my advisor, Greg Gilbert, and his the lead author was actually Juniper Harrower, who was they investigated this Joshua tree mycorrhizal system, where they found out that it was not so clear that fungi were always either parasites or mutualistic mycorrhizal partners. What they found actually was that the same set of fungi can act as parasites early in the tree's life, and over time, as the tree gets larger and more mature and healthier on its own, those fungi can change into mutualists. And this really, I think, drives home what the quiz at the beginning of tonight's talk was intended to sort of teach or communicate, which is that even if you're following a single individual tree and a single community of fungi in the same soil over the course of that tree's life, they may interact in different ways depending on the snapshot of the life cycle that you're looking at. So it's not really true or accurate to say that fungi are always mutualists or always parasites. It may change while you're watching, before your eyes. I think a really important paper to end on in terms of the research is a theoretical paper that someone who I'll talk about in just a few slides, Toby Kears and some of her collaborators, Scott et al., 2025, so just last year, they drew this important distinction between signals and cues. And what this means is, I want you to think back to that tomato experiment where there's a donor plant in the middle and all of the recipient plants are on the edge. They were getting information from that central plant, but the question we have to ask ourselves is that information coming in the form of a signal, which is sort of intentionally sent, or is it what they called a cue, which is unintentional information loss? So sort of just accidentally sending messages out into the environment. And just to give you a sense of what that really means, on the left, you see a bird of paradise. Very dramatic display. It's obviously sending what they call a signal, an intentional transfer of information out into the environment to other members of its species to show, I'm ready to mate, trying to convince a partner to make a nest with that individual bird. On the right, you see someone sneezing, and a sneeze is what they might label as a cue. You are not intending to send a message to the people around you that you're sick, but you can't hold it back. You just can't help but put that information out into the environment. And if other people are able to adjust their behavior because they heard you sneeze and they know what it means, they may be able to prevent getting sick by changing their physiology or their behavior. So what these authors are intending to do is to say that depending on what you're seeing, it may look the same, but it may actually be very different from a sort of a behavioral or an adaptive evolutionary origin. Some things are signals, some things are cues, and it may not be easy to tell if you are not the kind of organism that you're studying. So now I want to talk a little bit about the narratives that have emerged from all this. So back to our sort of timeline here, we're now over on the far right. Paul Stamets in 2008 gave this TED Talk where he emphasized how mushrooms can save the world. And it's what I would call sort of an early wave of myco-utopianism, where the idea was that fungi really might be able to help us get out of some of our biggest planetary challenges. And if you watch this TED Talk, it really is very ambitious and very aspirational. Some of this was carried through into 2021 when Suzanne Simard published Finding the Mother Tree and gave her own TED Talks and a lot of interviews and was profiled in many news outlets. And it was here that sort of problems started to emerge between what Suzanne Simard's research seemed to show in academic settings versus what her research was being turned into in public imagination. And unfortunately, she added to the confusion by sort of maintaining a different face in both places. So in at least some of her talks publicly, she would say things like, and this is a direct quote, "In ecosystems, there is only reciprocity. There is only mutual respect," which makes it feel like the only thing that you would ever find between trees in different species, of different species, or trees connected by the same fungus, exchanging resources, would be sort of a a Disney-fied version of constant reciprocity and resource exchange to maintain the health of the forest ecosystem as a whole, when in fact, when we look at some of the research that came out sort of in between those two eras, between her original finding and the most recent publications, that there's a lot more complication that you have to keep in mind, not this sort of simplistic feel-good story about reciprocity. Even though it is very alluring and attractive, it is still quite a bit more complicated than some of the public outlets made it seem. And of course, some of the most famous places that this showed up in literature were both in her book, Finding the Mother Tree, which was shown in Ted Lasso in the TV show, and as well as strains of this in Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, and even in things like James Cameron's Avatar movie, where there is literally a tree called the Mother Tree and a planet-wide network of connectivity by which sort of information is shared between all the organisms on the planet Pandora. So this really grabbed the public imagination in a big way, but it probably overstated some of the evidence that was present in academic research. And why is this? Well, after she started getting some criticism, Suzanne Simard said that she has been purposely using some of these anthropomorphic metaphors because she wanted to motivate people to care more about forests. And so she used these culturally weighted terms like mother. So we can sort of understand the motivation through this lens. But other people, like Toby Kears, understand the exact same systems through a totally different lens. And in fact, Toby Kears viewed it through a much more cutthroat model of market economics. And this screenshot from her own TED Talk, you'll notice there's a uniting theme here of TED Talks. In her TED Talk, she frames them as tiny capitalists. And she goes on to say that this is a market economy that's 400 million years old. And unlike human economies that rely on cognition to make decisions, traders, the fungi and the plants in this market, beg, borrow, steal, cheat, all in the absence of thought. So you can already detect that there's a really big difference in the narrative metaphors that Toby Kears is using versus those that Suzanne Simard is using, even though they're ostensibly talking about the same groups of organisms, mycorrhizal fungi and trees and shrubs that they're connected to. This particular angle sort of made Toby Kears a popular guest on podcasts, even just talking about Bitcoin, this idea that fungi might be really evolutionarily adapted and optimized market traders. That metaphor started to become attractive to a whole different set of people than those who were attracted to Suzanne Simard's research. But one last thing I'll mention about Toby Kears' Spun Underground Network conservation organization is that just like Paul Stamets, there is an idea that somehow we can understand these mycorrhizal networks in a way that will help us protect Earth's ecosystem. We're going to somehow harness them and use them to get ourselves out of a climate crisis. And this had its effects. In 2022, European Parliament suggested that they were going to integrate the Wood Wide Web theory into alignment with their sustainable forestry protocols. But I think for me and for a lot of other people in the academic community, this was really confusing because there is no core or center of what Wood Wide Web theory actually says. It's just a bunch of complicated findings, some of which are in conflict with one another, some of which directly contradict one another. There's not a single center of the Wood Wide Web theory that you can use to make sustainable forestry decisions. You actually just have to use all of the research, including the research that undermines the strength of the Wood Wide Web concept. And this sort of came to a head in 2023 when Justine Karst and some of her collaborators started to publish academic pushback to the Wood Wide Web concept. And they just said, we've kind of gotten the cart in front of the horse here. Our metaphors, our stories, the public imagination is all pushing us to view this research in one way. And we're sort of forgetting that there's all this other research that contradicts that, or that doesn't seem as comforting, that doesn't seem as potentially easy to turn into a narrative, and may make it harder to find sort of a center ground to stand on for making management decisions. But nevertheless, it's real good faith research that we have to keep in the front of our heads if we're trying to be honest about what we know about these systems. And so eventually this was published in the New York Times. Are trees talking underground? It's in dispute. And unfortunately, this is basically where we still are. It's not like we have made so much progress that we know some clear narrative to take away from all this. And I just want to stress how difficult it can be to communicate accurately out of academia and into the public, even through really reputable, respectable news outlets. So this headline that's on the screen from the Washington Post reads, "How a bat disease may have led to the death of more than 1,000 kids." And probably most of you, like I did, like most of the readers of this article did, assume that the bats transmitted some disease that killed 1,000 kids. But the actual story buried in this article was that the disease killed the bats, and the subsequent explosion of insect populations, because the bats were no longer present to eat them, the insects were the ones transmitting the disease to the kids. So this is a very misleadingly worded headline. And it's this sort of struggle that scientists constantly have to run on a treadmill with, knowing that their research will be slightly distorted, even just by the order of the words or the phrasing in the headlines that represent their research, and the public may get a totally incorrect idea, or at least a highly skewed or biased idea of what it is that their research actually showed. So the takeaways that I want to leave you with are primarily that I don't want to leave you with too many clear takeaways. I want you to live in the confusion and in the complexity of what the research actually tells us, which is many different things all at once, sometimes contradictory. One of the things to remember is that when you are studying fungal roots and fungal mycelium, tree roots and fungal mycelium, this is an underground system made of microscopic components. And that when we take a core sample, when we pull these roots out of the soil, that's destructive. We destroy the system that we're studying in the process of studying it. And we can't go back and see what the outcome of that root system was after we've sampled it to get to know what's actually happening there. So this is the academic way of saying it. Sampling is destructive, making repeated analysis over time problematic. But there's actually sort of a millennial or Gen Z meme about this that I think tells the story a lot better, which is, "I want to kiss every bug, but they are so small and my lips are so strong." If you try to get too close to some systems, some biological systems, your scale as a human being will interfere with the system you're studying, and it will change it. So you will only ever be able to know by approaching the system from a bunch of different routes and gleaning what you can from laboratory studies, ecological studies, theoretical predictions, and slowly getting a sense of what is going on. But you're never going to be able to observe these things directly in the sort of perfect way that you would like to if you were sort of an omnipotent scientist who could do anything and see anything. These systems are simultaneously microscopic, the level of fungal spores and hyphae, all the way to macroscopic, the size of a tree, the size of a sequoia tree, or the forest itself, or the landscape itself. They are so dynamic that they become paradoxical, like the research I showed you from Joshua trees, which shows that fungi may be parasitic at one point in the life cycle and mutualistic just a few months later in association with the same tree. So that feels paradoxical, but it just means that it's dynamic and that you can't take your findings from any moment to be generalizable to all of the lifespan of those organisms. And then lastly, we just need to remember that forests live much longer than humans. And a lot of these studies are done in greenhouse experiments where they only follow the outcomes of the growth of the tree or the fungus for a few months at a time. That does not necessarily say anything about what happens to these trees 100 or 1,000 years later. It's very hard to keep up research programs that long. Remember, we've only known about the mycorrhizal relationship for a couple hundred years as an entire scientific community. So we really need to stay humble about what we know yet. And that sort of brings me to one of my patron saints of scientific theory, the philosophy of science, Donna Haraway, who is a professor of the history of consciousness at UC Santa Cruz. And she just sort of spent a lot of her career trying to reiterate and remind us that science is done by people. There is no perfect, unbiased, perspectiveless scientist out there. There is no view from nowhere. everyone has some sort of metaphor, some sort of story, some sort of pre-committed language that they're embedded in. And you are going to have to do your best to use human words and human stories to communicate what the research in front of you actually says. But you're going to have to hold it lightly and say, even though I think I know what's going on, I don't. I am just a scientist humbly trying to make sense of this. And this author, Catherine Flynn, who did sort of an analysis of this whole backlash between Suzanne Simard and Justine Karst, put it really well. And so I want to read it to you. Between treating fungi as objects or as humans, I suggest a third way. Let's seek to understand fungi on their own terms, fundamentally unlike us. They are mute. We can't talk to them. They are rooted. They're on the underside of the soil, and they're inscrutable. We cannot really make sense of what it is that they are communicating when they send or just transmit unintentionally chemicals or information between each other and between the plants they're attached to. And she just finishes by saying, we need to meet the challenge of cultivating respect for organisms that are different from us, in their separate and complex bodies, in their sophisticated interactions, and in their unfathomable lives. And what I really like about this quote is that it suggests that we just need to remain curious, we need to remain humble about what we think we know, and really commit in a world that sort of drives us towards deciding on a narrative and attaching our identities to the feeling that we understand a particular topic through a particular lens. We just need to commit to saying we will never have the full answer. The mystery will always be bigger than what we can know. Even if we do a really good job as scientists, there will always be something missing. We'll never be inside these organisms themselves. And so I'll leave you with a little excerpt from a poem, slightly paraphrased from Gary Snyder. And he just reminds us to stay together. So the whole point here is to be in community with one another as people, to learn about these marvelous organisms that are out in the world, far bigger than us, far older, and that which will extend further into the future, and to tread lightly, to just hold all of our conceptions with humility, able to go in and out of them fluidly and without our egos and identities invested in any particular explanation. That's the end of my talk tonight. So thanks so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the questions we've got.
Wow, chat, can we give it up for Christian? Please give him some love. I'm loving the energy and the humor in the chat. Christian, when the talk ends, I definitely encourage you to read through them. They're really funny. Chad, this is now your reminder to submit those questions. And while I'm going to give you guys time to do that. But yeah, Christian, I think what really resonated with me when you gave your talk is the living in the confusion part. I think earlier we saw people get really frustrated when we were saying the true, false, or other, and the answer was other. And I think oftentimes in science, we chase the answers. It has to be this or that. And I think living in the confusion and living in the uncertainty is kind of the beauty of what you're sharing in your talk. Nature is not ever perfect. It's so complex. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at here today with this talk. And the image of fungus slurping sugar through a straw, and between the various relationships between a tree and a fungus and an orchid is also very visceral for me. And so I appreciated that. But yeah, let's Alexa in the backstage just flash some of the thank yous that folks are sharing. You're getting so much love in the chat. While that's going, I'm going to share some of the questions that our audience members pre-submitted. I'll get through a few of those and then we'll get to the live audience questions. Okay. Here is an interesting one. Are there structural properties of mycorrhizal networks like redundancy, hubs, or resilience that resemble human neural or social networks in a meaningful way? Or is that analogy mostly metaphorical?
This is such a good question because it has all of its own answers contained within it. All I need to do is read it back to you in slightly altered format, and you, I think, are already on the right track. So the answer is definitely yes. And I think if you talk to someone like Toby Kears or Paul Stamets, you would get a wholehearted yes. They are fungal networks are basically the same as human social networks or neural networks. But I think what you also mentioned is worth keeping in mind, which is that this similarity may have its limits. It may only be a superficial structural similarity. And depending on the particular question you're asking, it may not operate that way at all. And the problem is that we don't have a very direct way of asking a fungal network that question. We don't have a way of manipulating it or testing it in the same way we do a neural network that lives on a computer that we can sort of more directly manipulate. So it could be that the answer is yes, depending on what you're trying to track, the flows or the redundancies or the structures. But in other ways, the answer could be no. And even if you get a perfect answer for one fungus, remember that all fungi are different and all plants are different. And in new combinations, they may not exhibit the same behavior as they did when you tested it.
All right, thank you. Another pre-submitted question before we get to the live chat. How are fungal networks affected by fertilizers? Do mycorrhizae thrive best in native soils?
So I'm going to keep this one short by giving you a very specific answer that is not necessarily the whole answer, but we know for sure that at least some fungi are negatively affected by fertilizers, and that if you add nitrogen to the soil, fungi appear to lose their competitive edge because they no longer are such a favored partner for the plants, because the plants can get their nitrogen by themselves, and they don't need to actually barter sugar with the fungus. So that's just one example of fertilizers potentially working against the interests of some groups of fungi. But of course, like I said, every fungus is different, and we know that fertilizers actually increase the populations of other groups of fungi. So it depends who you're talking about.
Gotcha. Okay, let's go to the chat here. So Elizabeth earlier asked, can mushrooms sense when we walk through their habitats? Or maybe what kind of info can they convey to the mycelium network? I know you were talking about sugars and carbons, and predators like aphids, but can they tell if we're walking around them? Are we predators to them?
That's a great question. I don't know that there is an obvious answer to, like, if they are touch sensitive or sensitive to pressure. You would have to sort of be monitoring that fungal network in real time while you were stepping on it. But we don't have technology currently that can monitor what's happening inside that network without being its own disturbance. So you would have no way of knowing if it was your footsteps on the network or the actual act of monitoring that was causing the change in what was being communicated. So this is an example of, we are just too big and we're the wrong kind of organism to be able to look at that in real time and know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Is it kind of like Schrodinger's cat? It's like you don't know if you observe it or you don't observe it. It's just
it's a lot less complicated than, you don't have to go all the way to quantum physics to talk about it. You can just say it's really hard to know without disturbing a system what's going on in it.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. This viewer asks, is it because of mycorrhizae that only certain mushrooms exist in certain locations?
Yeah, that's not the only reason that fungi are local, but it's one of the major reasons that if there's not an oak tree, you're not going to get a chanterelle in coastal California. And certain oak trees are better hosts for chanterelles than others. So anyone who is a sort of experienced chanterelle picker is going to tell you that it has a lot to do with the mycorrhizal connections between the chanterelles and the particular oak that structures where they go looking. You're not going to go to a young eucalyptus forest or even a young oak forest. You want a more mature oak forest.
Mm-hmm. More humorously, fungi versus fungi. What's the difference? What's accurate?
I used to say fungi and now I say fungi. So just like the parasites and the mutualists, I changed over the course of my life. There is no single answer. You just say what sounds good to you. If you go to Europe, you'll hear them say fungi. So there's many variations of this. In Italy, it's fungi.
Got it. Tomato, potato, potato.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Another viewer asks, are there specific tree types that have been shown to discriminate among fungal partners? Have researchers found that specific trees are more prone to discriminate than others?
That is a really good question. I would argue that it makes sense that trees which are mycorrhizal specialists that have a narrow range of fungi that they partner with are probably more highly adapted down this road. And in fact, the two papers that I showed you, or the two examples that I showed you about fungal discrimination, used a specialist tree, a larch tree that has a very narrow range of fungi that it can associate with. So I would expect things like larches, pines, some of these hyper specialized mycorrhizal genera of trees to be better, and trees that are more widespread or don't have as many partners might be less able to do that kind of fine scale discrimination.
Okay. Going back to the Joshua trees, could the relationship change due to environment conditions, perhaps during events that stress the tree or fungus?
Absolutely. In fact, the paper included an example of this. I only mentioned that it changed over the course of the Joshua tree's life, but there was a whole other secondary part of that paper showing that if you take soil from higher up elevations and transplant it to low elevation Joshua trees and vice versa, that they have totally different effects on the tree depending on where the soil came from and which sort of community of soil fungi and microbes came with it. So yeah, there's even local adaptation in one slope between high elevation and low elevation. Warmer, drier, cooler, wetter.
Yeah, it's so different imagining fungi in Joshua Tree. So I appreciate that reminder that fungi are everywhere, not just in beautiful Redwood Coast. Okay, so viewer asked here, do you think science is harmed by our anthropomorphizing or understanding of an organism? Or can anthropomorphizing, when done correctly, aid in understanding?
That is the $10 million question. That is sort of the entire question that I did not give you an answer to in tonight's lecture. I don't know. Everyone is struggling to find the point where the metaphor runs out of steam and it does more harm than good. But I do think that I want to go on record saying that I don't think we can do this without metaphor. I'm not suggesting that there is any way to move forward without stories, without imperfect, imprecise human language. We just have to do that. That's just the only thing we've got. We talk to one another using a shared vocabulary, a shared knowledge of stereotypes and stories, and we can't get around that. The only thing we can do is to learn to hold it very humbly and very lightly, and just be open when our preferred explanatory model fails or runs out or is shown to be contradictory or contradicted by some new evidence.
Definitely. Okay, let's keep going to sciencey questions. Has the mycorrhizal relationship to fire been studied?
Oh yeah, lots. I mean, everyone who is a biologist in California is necessarily now a fire biologist. We're all studying fire, whether we like it or not. I was doing a long-term study on fungi in Big Basin State Park in Santa Cruz, and I never intended for it to be a fire study, but 2 years of my study went by, and then the whole park burned in the CZU fire. And so the last year of my study was a post-fire study. And what I can tell you is that different trees are affected very differently by fire. And so the fungi that are mycorrhizal associates of those different trees have totally different outcomes in terms of how long it will take for them to regrow in the park after the fire has passed through. So I'll just say that it's complicated. It's dependent on the species, but there is such a huge body of research now. And it's in its early days. You can expect that more and more will be learned about the mycorrhizal relationship to fire in the years to come, both as the state becomes, increasingly burned, as well as, there are just more people doing it. But there are positive effects and there are negative effects depending on what you're talking about.
Very cool. Viewer asks, how far can these networks reach in the wild?
That's a really cool question. I always come back to an example from the Great Lakes region where there are these large sandy expanses, almost like pure sand soil, and pine trees and fungi that can be found like hundreds of feet away from the trees out in these big sand dunes. And because of the biology of that fungus, that it has to be connected to the trees hundreds of feet away. And so it just shows you that in these sandy soils where roots can move very easily, where they can grow long distances laterally, that some of these spatial scales are huge. Sometimes it's very small in forests where there's a lot of rocky soils or where the terrain is very steep and sort of heterogeneous, but in places where it's very homogeneous, very flat, pretty much the same soil, not a lot of interruption, we have seen evidence, I've seen personally evidence to suggest this can be hundreds of feet. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty incredible to see it all. This is an interesting question. Viewer asked, do you have any ideas on decolonizing our scientific relationship with fungi outside of meeting them where they're at? How does engaging with other knowledge systems like traditional ecological knowledge fit into fungal research?
That's such a huge question that I can barely begin to answer it right now. But one of the easiest ways of answering it, and probably the only one I'm qualified to say right now, is that when you engage with other knowledge systems, you just get access to a whole new constellation of metaphors that were not the metaphors that you were brought up in a sort of a Western scientific or traditional scientific approach. So I think there are many examples of scientists finding that added layer of metaphors or new metaphors that they had not been exposed to previously gave them additional research insights or potential avenues to pursue. But I think in other cases, it's important to remember that they don't have to perfectly align or overlap. You don't actually have to make two worldviews work perfectly together. You can simply say that this worldview works over here and this worldview works in parallel, and they are not required to ever be fully reconciled. And I actually think that that's something that I'm particularly interested in, is not requiring one to sort of take precedence over the other, but at the same time allowing both of them to coexist without requiring that they homogenize.
Yeah, that's a big question, and definitely a lot more to explore there. Okay, so let's see. We have maybe 5 more minutes for questions. You are blowing through them really great. So thank you, viewers, eager viewers, submitting your questions. And let's keep it going. Okay, this viewer wants to know, can you explain more about how sampling mushrooms changes the systems? Instead of fully removing the fruiting body, could you sample a small amount and not cause a large impact?
We don't know, because we can only sample after having caused the impact. There is only I'm trying to take can you put that question back up on screen I can read it? But yeah, the idea would be, we want to sample a mycelium in situ. What I mean by that is while it's in the forest, and determine what's going on in its cells in the moment we sampled it. But our technology doesn't allow us to do it that fast in real time without causing a relatively large disturbance. In fact, almost all of what we are able to do is because we are able to model it in the laboratory, growing some fungi and plants in very artificial settings, sort of learning how they work in that setting, and then using those sort of guesses to monitor what's happening in forest systems, using these slightly more destructive or more disruptive sampling methodologies. So there is no way to say, oh no, I took such a small amount of hyphae that I'm sure I didn't cause any disturbance or change anything about the mycelium. That's just not something we can say. We have to assume that something changed as we sort of, especially if we are committed to the idea that these fungi are so sensitive and so able to transmit information quickly or extensively across their mycelium, we have to assume that anything we do is going to have some effect on their physiology or their response.
Another viewer asks, I'm a student looking to study and work in mycology. Where did you get your start? Any tips? And also thank you for the great presentation.
I just got my start in the forest, and I really don't think you should skip that step. It's really easy to skip that step. When you get involved in academia, you are sort of encouraged to work in the lab and read a lot of theory. And I think I would really regret if we had a bunch of people who studied mushrooms but didn't have a good relationship with the forests and the fungi as you encounter them out in the world on their own terms. So whatever you do, I'm certainly not the person to give advice on academia, because my trajectory has not been towards sort of pure research. It's more about science communication. But it would just be a tragedy for you personally if you did not spend a lot of time getting to know these organisms out in the woods. So do a lot of the natural history, the old school style of getting to know these wild organisms. And then if you do go into academia, I would just recommend learning to tell stories without overemphasizing a single narrative. And that's actually a hard thing to do these days, because you're kind of encouraged by academic conferences or journals to have really punchy messages that are very sexy or compelling or easy to remember. But that can actually obscure what you actually found, what you're trying to say, the value you've got to add to the world with your research.
I want to go back to this one question from the pre-submitted list here. Do you have any recommendations for public attitudes and policies towards mushrooms? Just knowing everything you just shared today. Message to the world.
Well, I think a good place to start is that this year there was all of these mushroom poisonings in Central California. Unfortunately, I think at least 3 people have died. Multiple dozens have suffered greatly, liver damage, and were in severe condition. And the response from the California Department of Health was, in my opinion, just really reactive, and not in a good way. Reactive in the sense that they warned people to not go mushrooming at all, to not eat any wild mushrooms, and to basically practice abstinence-only mushrooming. And that is a way of keeping people safe, but it's a way of keeping people safe that is, it doesn't develop knowledge over time. It just sort of requires you to be to sort of insulate yourself in ignorance, to remain ignorant but safe because you're choosing not to engage with these organisms anymore. And so I wish that what I saw more of was outreach to the communities that were affected by these poisonings, and really trying to get to the bottom of how did it happen? What was it that you thought you were eating? Why was there a miscommunication between what public health officials have tried to communicate to the general public before? Why didn't that reach you? How is this knowledge being transmitted or failing to be transmitted between different members of the community? Because I think that we could get to a place where that doesn't really happen anymore if we had sort of a sustained effort over the years, and really educated communities of information poor mushroom hunters. So I guess my basic sense is that we're still coming out of a long history of avoiding mushrooms, mycophobia, as the way to engage with them. And thankfully, we're pretty much out. We're almost all the way out of that. Events like this that Megan runs, Peninsula Open Space Trust runs, the mushroom fairs all over the state, and honestly, books like Suzanne Simard's book and Paul Stamets's talks and Louis Schwartzberg's fantastic fungi movies have done a lot to just change Americans' attitudes towards being positive about fungi. So when I started doing this back in 2004, it was a totally different public climate, public culture around mushrooms than we enjoy nowadays. So I don't think I really need to tip the scales too much. We're getting there as a community of people. We're getting there, especially in California. So just keep doing what we're doing.
Yes, and recreate responsibly, stay on trail, and be safe out there. Well, thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, chat, for all your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. There were so many juicy ones, but so limited time to get through all of them. So, Christian, before we say goodbye to you, would you like to share anything, or how can people learn more about you?
The best way to stay on top of what I'm doing is by following me on Instagram, Biodiversifile. And if you want to learn more about your local ecologies, your local mushrooms, your local plants, any organism you find in the woods, just make an iNaturalist account. Download the iNaturalist app on your phone and treat it like a social network. It's not just a place for you to upload photos and get an answer. It's a place for you to meet people and to ask questions to people who will hopefully give you a real human answer. It's a place where there's like a real sort of a network of people still sort of communicating in the way that the early internet was supposed to. So I really value that community for that reason.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Christian. Let's take a picture so I can screenshot it later. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Well, chat, give so much love to Christian, and we'll say goodbye to you. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks for having me tonight, Megan.
Bye.
Thanks, Alexa.
Okay, wait, chat, but don't go anywhere. I got a few more announcements for you. If you want more mushroom content, check out our latest blog, A Beginner's Guide to the Bay Area Mushrooms, Where and How to Spot Them and Responsibly. You can scan that QR code or check the link in the chat to learn more. I encourage you to check it out. And if you enjoyed this event and you wanted to attend the next event, we're hosting a presentation called The Amazing Nature of Animal Senses, featuring Ed Yong, a New York best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize writer winner. So check that out March 3rd. It's both in person in Mountain View as well as virtual online. If you want to learn more, check out the link in the chat and the QR code. As well, we host many free guided walks, hikes, in-person events, volunteer work days, and more. So check out our events on our website if you want to get more involved with what we do here at Post. And if you want information on the latest hiking guides, where to go if you have a dog, sign up for a hiking calendar to get suggested hikes every single month. Our guided hikes page is the resource for you, so check that out as well. Also, follow us on social media to be the first one to hear about all the latest news, updates, events, and more. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. We're both active there. Links are in the chat, or scan that QR code. And last but not least, did you like tonight's event? We'd love to know. Please give us your feedback by filling out the survey. You can either scan that code or click the link in the chat and let us know. What was your favorite thing? What would you like to see improve? What's the next topic you would like to hear? Anyways, thanks for being here. Again, my name is Megan Wynn. It's been a pleasure to be your host tonight. Thank you, Christian Schwarz, for being our expert presenter. Thank you, chat, for being live and engaged. We'll see you next time. Good night, everybody. Fill out that survey.